So, I began, trying to sound as serious and confident as possible. I'm looking for some gargoyles for my front yard. Okay, Agnes replied, her voice non-committal. What size are you thinking? Big, I said. Very big and menacing. I want them to look like they could scare away. Well, anything. There was a pause. Anything in particular? Agnes asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Nosy neighbors, I said without hesitation, and overzealous HOA presidents. Agnes chuckled. I think we can handle that. The morning after the Gnome genocide, as I'd dramatically dubbed it, my front yard looked wrong. It was too clean, too empty, too compliant. The small, cheerful gnomes, once scattered amongst the flower beds, were gone, packed away in a box in the garage, victims of Beatrice Harding's relentless war on whimsy. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, surveying the scene. The grass was neatly mowed, the bushes were trimmed, the flower beds were relatively weed-free. It was a perfectly acceptable suburban yard, a picture of HOA-approved blandness. And it made me want to scream. The yard looked empty, sterile, devoid of any personality. It was exactly what Beatrice wanted. And that's what made me snap, I thought. A feeling of cold fury rising within me. The gnomes had been harmless, a small act of personal expression, a touch of playful rebellion against the suffocating conformity of Coral Ridge Estates. And now, they were gone, banished by the Queen of Beige and her clipboard-wielding army. The emptiness of the yard was a physical representation of the HOA's power, a constant reminder of their control, and I was not going to stand for it. I paced around the yard, my mind racing, searching for a solution, a way to fight back, a way to reclaim my right to decorate my own property without fear of HOA reprisal. I could, of course, simply ignore the rules, put the gnomes back out, and face the inevitable fines and legal threats. But that felt unsatisfying. I wanted something more, something bolder, something that would not only defy Beatrice, but would also make a statement, a declaration of independence from HOA tyranny. And then it hit me. A spark of an idea, dark and delicious, began to take shape in my mind. If the HOA had a problem with small, decorative figures, then I'd give them something large. If they hated cheerful gnomes, then I'd give them something menacing. If Beatrice hated my cheerful little gnomes, then she was going to despise what I had in mind. It was time to go gothic, I thought, a slow, mischievous grin spreading across my face. I envisioned my yard, transformed, no longer a bland expanse of grass, but a dramatic, imposing, slightly terrifying landscape, dominated by creatures of stone and shadow. It was the perfect solution, the ultimate act of petty revenge, and a way to exploit the HOA's own rules against them. My descent into the world of Gothic architecture and monstrous statuary began, as all great and terrible ideas do, with the internet. I needed to find the perfect replacements for my banished gnomes, something that would be both aesthetically striking and utterly HOA-proof. My browser history went from lawn gnome care tips to gargoyle statues for sale and are gargoyles considered good luck? In record time, I chuckled as I delved into the surprisingly vast online marketplace for Gothic decor. I discovered that gargoyles, those grotesque winged creatures that adorn medieval cathedrals and castles, were not just relics of the past. They were readily available in a variety of sizes, materials, and levels of menacing detail. I learned about their history, their symbolism. Apparently, they were originally designed to ward off evil spirits, which seemed oddly appropriate. and their various architectural styles. I also researched large-scale outdoor sculptures, exploring the world of abstract art, modern installations, and monumental statues. I needed to understand the legal and logistical challenges of placing something big in my front yard. I needed to make sure that my plan, however audacious, was also feasible. And, of course, I revisited the dreaded HOA bylaws, searching for any clause, any phrase, any vaguely worded regulation that might prohibit my plan. And to my delight, I found a crucial loophole. The HOA rules specifically banned small decorative figures, with figures being the key word. There was nothing about large sculptures. There was nothing about abstract art. There was nothing about gargoyles. The HOA, in their obsession with controlling the minutiae of suburban life, had overlooked the possibility of a large-scale Gothic rebellion. They'd left the door wide open, and I was about to storm through it, armed with stone creatures and a burning desire for revenge. I started sketching, rough ideas of placement and scale, my grin widening with each stroke of the pencil. This was going to be epic. My lawn gnomes were my little rebellion, a quiet, colorful protest against the beige monotony of Coral Ridge estates. They weren't anything fancy, just a collection of cheerful little fellows, scattered amongst the flower beds. A fisherman gnome, eternally casting his line into a patch of petunias. A gnome reading a book, perched precariously on a moss-covered rock. Even a gnome riding a tiny, ceramic snail, forever frozen in a slow-motion race across the lawn. I found them amusing. They added a touch of whimsy to my otherwise ordinary suburban yard. They were a conversation starter, a source of mild amusement for passers-by, and, for me, a small reminder that not everything in life had to be serious and sensible. They weren't hurting anyone. They weren't offensive. They certainly weren't obscene, unlike some of the inflatable holiday decorations I'd seen around the neighborhood. They were just gnomes. But in the meticulously manicured world of Coral Ridge estates, whimsy was a dangerous thing, and I was about to learn that even the smallest, most innocent lawn ornament could become a casualty in the war against HOA conformity. I should have seen it coming, I suppose. The warning signs were there. The meticulously worded newsletters, the passive-aggressive notes left on doors, the constant, watchful eyes of the neighborhood busybodies. But I'd underestimated the sheer, unadulterated pettiness of the homeowners association. It arrived, as all instruments of HOA tyranny do, in a crisp, white envelope, slipped under my front door with the stealth and precision of a ninja delivering a death warrant. The notice was stark, to the point, and utterly ridiculous. Lawn ornament violation. All unauthorized decorative figures must be removed immediately. The words were printed in bold, all-caps letters, as if my cheerful little gnomes were a threat to national security. The notice went on to cite some obscure bylaw about maintaining a cohesive community aesthetic and preventing visual clutter. It threatened escalating fines and potential legal action if I failed to comply within 7 days. The confrontation was inevitable. Beatrice Harding, president of the HOA and the neighborhood's self-appointed arbiter of good taste, appeared on my doorstep the very next morning, her clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice as cold and sharp as a freshly sharpened pencil, "those gnomes are unacceptable. They're tacky. They're distracting. They simply do not conform to the standards of our community." I tried to reason with her, to explain that the gnomes were harmless, that they brought me joy, that they were, in fact, quite popular with the neighborhood children. But it was no use. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter," she said, her lips pursed in a tight, disapproving line. And the rules clearly state that all lawn ornaments must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Your gnomes were not. She said the last sentence with such finality as though she'd condemned them to death. I stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and simmering resentment building inside me. Fine. If she wants to play this game, you're about to change the rules entirely. This wasn't just about gnomes anymore. It was about principle. It was about the right to express my own individuality, to add a touch of personality to my own property, without being harassed by a power-hungry, aesthetically challenged busybody. And I was not about to back down. My gnomeless yard was a blank canvas, a stage waiting for its new, dramatically different cast of characters. It was time to unleash the Gargoyles. Finding a company that specialized in custom-made large-scale stone sculptures proved surprisingly easy. Apparently, there's a niche market for everything, even terrifying stone creatures designed to ward off evil spirits and HOA presidents. I contacted Stone Sentinels, a company based somewhere in the Midwest that advertised handcrafted gargoyles, mythical creatures, and architectural accents. Their website featured a gallery of their creations, ranging from the traditionally grotesque to the surprisingly whimsical. The ordering process was unique. I spoke to a customer service representative named, improbably, Agnes, who sounded like she'd dealt with her fair share of unusual requests. So, I began, trying to sound as serious and confident as possible. I'm looking for some gargoyles for my front yard. Okay, Agnes replied, her voice non-committal. What size are you thinking? Big, I said. Very big and menacing. I want them to look like they could scare away, well, anything. There was a pause. Anything in particular? Agnes asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Nosy neighbors, I said without hesitation, and overzealous HOA presidents. Agnes chuckled. I think we can handle that. We spent the next half hour discussing the specifics. I ordered 3 gargoyles, a centerpiece, a 7-foot-tall crouching gargoyle with bat-like wings, partially unfurled, a snarling face, and claws that looked sharp enough to shred steel, and a pair of smaller but still imposing horned sentinels, each clutching a massive stone staff to flank the walkway. And because why not? I added the dragon. 5 feet tall, curled around on a plinth. It would complete the effect. You're sure about this? Agnes asked as she finalized the order. These are substantial pieces, and they're not exactly subtle. Subtlety is overrated, I replied. I'm going for impact. The arrival of the Gargoyles was an event that would forever be etched in the memories of the residents of Coral Ridge Estates. It was like watching a scene from a fantasy movie, only instead of a dragon soaring overhead, it was a flatbed truck loaded with enormous stone creatures. The deliveries were staggered, each gargoyle arriving in its own massive wooden crate, carefully packed and protected for transport. The truck drivers, seasoned professionals used to hauling heavy loads, looked at me with a mixture of bewilderment and awe. You're putting these... where? One of them asked, gesturing towards my relatively small front yard. Right there, I said, pointing to the empty spaces where my gnomes had once stood. Strategic placement is key. The unloading process was a logistical challenge. Each gargoyle weighed hundreds of pounds, requiring a forklift, a team of workers, and a whole lot of careful maneuvering. The crates were enormous, dominating my driveway and attracting the attention of every passerby. I'd timed the deliveries for weekdays, when I knew Beatrice was usually out, enforcing her beige agenda on some other unsuspecting homeowner. But I still had to be discreet. I covered the crates with tarps, pretending they were just landscaping supplies. I told the curious neighbors that I was redoing the front yard, adding some drama. But the secrecy only added to the excitement. It was like preparing for a surprise party, only instead of balloons and cake, it was giant stone gargoyles. And instead of celebrating a birthday, it was celebrating the glorious downfall of HOA tyranny, with the gargoyles safely delivered and hidden as much as possible under tarps. It was time for the installation. This was not a task I could handle on my own. I enlisted the help of a few strong and slightly crazy friends, promising them pizza, beer, and the satisfaction of participating in the most epic HOA takedown in suburban history. The centerpiece, the 7-foot-tall crouching gargoyle, was positioned front and center, directly in line with my front door, its snarling face and outstretched claws greeting anyone who dared to approach. It was a statement piece, a declaration of war, a giant stone "screw you" to Beatrice Harding and her obsession with conformity. The 2 sentinel gargoyles, each about 4 feet tall, were placed on either side of the walkway, their horned heads and stone staffs creating a menacing, yet strangely elegant entrance. They looked like guardians of some ancient temple, protectors of a sacred space, ready to strike down any who violated the sanctity of my, formerly gnome-infested, front yard. The dragon was placed carefully on the plinth, facing out towards the road. The placement was strategic, designed to maximize the shock and awe effect. I wanted the gargoyles to be visible from the street, from Beatrice's house, from everywhere in the neighborhood. I wanted them to be unavoidable, impossible to ignore, a constant reminder of my defiance. The process was challenging, requiring a combination of brute force, careful planning, and a healthy dose of improvisation. We used ropes, pulleys, and even a borrowed engine hoist to maneuver the massive sculptures into place. There were a few near disasters, a couple of close calls, and a whole lot of swearing, but finally, after hours of intense labor, the gargoyles were in position, their stone eyes gleaming in the afternoon sun, ready to unleash their silent fury upon the unsuspecting residents of Coral Ridge Estates. With the gargoyles installed, the transformation was complete. My front yard, once a bland expanse of grass and a few banished gnomes, was now it was hard to describe. It was a miniature Gothic fortress, a landscape of stone and shadow, a testament to the power of creative and slightly unhinged landscaping. The contrast between the dark, imposing gargoyles and the surrounding beige houses was striking. It was as if a portal to another dimension had opened up in the middle of suburbia, spilling forth creatures of myth and legend. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was perfect. But I needed one final touch, one last detail to complete the effect, to truly drive home the message of my rebellion. I needed a sign, not a standard "beware of dog" sign or a cutesy "welcome" sign. No, I needed something more dramatic, something more appropriate. I spent an afternoon in my garage, crafting a handmade wooden sign. I painted it black with bold Gothic-style lettering. And the words I chose? A simple yet powerful declaration of my victory. Henderson's Grim. I mounted the sign above the front door, directly beneath the watchful gaze of the crouching gargoyle. It was the final, glorious touch. The perfect finishing flourish to my masterpiece of petty revenge. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was perfect. And it was all completely 100% HOA loophole compliant, probably, I thought, surveying my creation with a mixture of pride and amusement. The stage was set. The gargoyles were in position. And Beatrice Harding was about to have a very, very bad day. The unveiling of Henderson's Grim was a moment I'd been eagerly anticipating, and Beatrice Harding's reaction did not disappoint. It was a symphony of outrage, a masterclass in Karen-esque meltdown, a performance that deserved an award, or, at the very least, a restraining order. I'd strategically timed the reveal for a Saturday morning, knowing that Beatrice took a meticulously scheduled power walk through the neighborhood at precisely 8 a.m. I was waiting, coffee in hand, hidden behind the curtains of my living room window, ready to witness the glorious spectacle. And then it happened. She rounded the corner, her pastel pink tracksuit a jarring contrast to the gray stone of my newly installed gargoyles. She saw them, and she stopped. Her reaction was visceral. It was a full-body experience. Her jaw dropped, her eyes widened, and her face went through a series of colors that I didn't even know were possible. She looked like she'd just stumbled upon a nest of vipers, or perhaps a particularly offensive display of improperly placed garden gnomes. Then, the scream. It wasn't just a scream, it was a primal shriek, a sound that seemed to tear through the quiet morning air, shattering the peace of Sunridge Estates. It was a scream that could curdle milk, shatter glass, and probably scare small children into behaving for weeks. This is an outrage, she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that could only be described as ear-splitting. She stormed towards my house, her fists clenched, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. You've turned your yard into a graveyard. It's demonic. I emerged from behind the crouching gargoyle, a picture of calm, unruffled composure. Good morning, Beatrice, I said, my voice dripping with feigned politeness. I see you've noticed my new additions. What do you think? I was going for a gothic, yet welcoming vibe. They're gargoyles, she roared, her face now a shade of purple that I'd previously only seen on particularly ripe eggplants. Giant, hideous, terrifying gargoyles. They're not gnomes. Exactly, I replied with a smile. They're architectural accents, Beatrice, a tribute to Gothic design, a celebration of stone craftsmanship, and, as I'm sure you're aware, the HOA guidelines specifically prohibit small decorative figures. These, I gestured towards the towering gargoyles, are clearly not small. Nor are they figurines. They are sculptures. Watching Beatrice's face contort with rage and horror was more satisfying than any perfectly manicured lawn could ever be, I thought, struggling to suppress a laugh. She sputtered, she fumed, she threatened, but it was all for naught. The gargoyles were here to stay. My inbox almost immediately began to fill up. Email after email, all from the HOA, forwarded no doubt by a furious and desperate Beatrice. Beatrice, predictably, did not take her defeat lying down. She launched an all-out assault on my gargoyles, attempting to use every weapon in her bureaucratic arsenal to force their removal. She called an emergency HOA meeting, demanding immediate action. She cited obscure bylaws, misinterpreted zoning regulations, and even tried to claim that the gargoyles were a public safety hazard. Apparently, she was concerned that they might fall over and crush someone, despite the fact that they were securely anchored to concrete foundations. She presented a slideshow of evidence, featuring blurry photos of the gargoyles, taken from unflattering angles and accompanied by captions like demonic influence and a threat to property values. But it was no use. The HOA's lawyer, the long-suffering Mr. Henderson, a familiar face in my suburban battles, was forced to explain, yet again, that there was nothing they could do. The gargoyles, he pointed out, were technically sculptures, not figurines, and therefore not subject to the HOA's ban on small decorative figures. There were no size restrictions on architectural accents, and the gargoyles, while certainly unconventional, did not violate any existing rules or regulations.
But, they're gargoyles!
Beatrice sputtered, her voice cracking with desperation.
They're hideous!
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, Beatrice, I said calmly. And frankly, I find them quite charming. They're also, as Mr. Henderson has pointed out, perfectly legal. I made sure to highlight specific sections of the bylaws that backed my case, referencing sizes and placement, enjoying her increasingly frustrated reactions. The meeting ended in disarray, with Beatrice's demands ignored, her authority undermined, and her vision of a gnome-free, gargoyle-free utopia shattered. While Beatrice fumed and plotted, the rest of the neighborhood was reacting to my gargoyles with a mixture of amusement, admiration, and a growing sense of what on earth is going on over there. At first, there were the stares, the whispers, the hesitant questions. But soon people started to embrace the absurdity of it all. Families would stroll by in the evenings, admiring the imposing stone creatures, their shadows stretching long and dramatic in the twilight. Children would point and giggle, inventing stories about the gargoyles, imagining them as guardians of the neighborhood, protectors against evil spirits, and perhaps overzealous HOA presidents. Teenagers started using the gargoyles as a backdrop for their social media posts, posing in front of them, striking dramatic poses, and generally adding to the growing legend of the Gargoyle House. Even some of the older residents, the ones who'd initially sided with Beatrice, started to come around, admitting that the gargoyles were rather impressive and added a certain je ne sais quoi to the neighborhood. The local art scene, always on the lookout for something new and unconventional, got involved. A local art critic wrote a surprisingly positive review of my installation, praising its bold juxtaposition of medieval and suburban aesthetics and its subversive commentary on the nature of conformity. A group of art students even started showing up, sketching the gargoyles, studying their forms, and generally treating my front yard like an open-air museum. It was a bizarre, unexpected, and utterly delightful turn of events. My act of petty revenge had inadvertently transformed my house into a local landmark, a source of community amusement, and a surprisingly popular destination for art enthusiasts. Beatrice, desperate to find some way to retaliate, resorted to her last, most pathetic weapon: the noise complaint. She claimed that the gargoyles were emitting disturbing noises, that they were disrupting the peace and quiet of the neighborhood, and that they were, in short, a public nuisance. Of course, the gargoyles were made of stone. They were silent. They did not emit any noises, disturbing or otherwise. But Beatrice was not to be deterred. She filed a formal complaint with the city, demanding that an investigation be launched into the unnatural sounds emanating from my property. And that's when I got my second stroke of genius. If Beatrice wanted noise, I'd give her noise. But I'd give it to her in a way that was both legally compliant and utterly gloriously inappropriate. I purchased a set of high-quality weatherproof speakers, and I carefully concealed them inside the gargoyles, wiring them to a sound system in my garage. And then I found the perfect soundtrack: Gregorian chants. At precisely 3 a.m. the next morning, a deep, resonant, echoing chant filled the night air of Sunridge Estates. It was the sound of monks singing ancient hymns, a sound that was both beautiful and strangely unsettling, especially when emanating from a collection of stone gargoyles in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. Beatrice, I later learned, was not amused. She called the police. She called the HOA. She even, reportedly, called a local exorcist, convinced that my gargoyles were possessed by some kind of demonic spirit. But it was all for naught. The police, after checking the decibel levels, which were, of course, well within the legal limits, informed her that there was nothing they could do. The HOA, already defeated and demoralized, simply shrugged. And the Gregorian chants continued, a nightly serenade of sonic defiance, a testament to the power of petty revenge, and a constant, unavoidable reminder of Beatrice Harding's utter and complete failure. The Gregorian chants, emanating from the mouths of my stone gargoyles at 3 a.m., were the final straw. The HOA, already reeling from the legal battles, the neighborhood support for the castle, and the viral fame of my architectural statement completely collapsed. Beatrice, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, attempted to rally support for one last desperate push to have the gargoyles removed. She called an emergency meeting, she sent out frantic emails. She even, reportedly, tried to organize a protest in front of my house, which attracted exactly 3 people, 2 of whom were her own relatives. But it was no use. The HOA members, tired of her constant complaining, exhausted by her endless battles, and secretly amused by my increasingly elaborate acts of defiance, had had enough. They'd seen the writing on the wall, or rather, the gargoyles on the lawn, and they knew that Beatrice's reign of terror was over. The meeting, which Beatrice had envisioned as a triumphant return to power, ended in a humiliating defeat. Her proposals were voted down, her arguments were ignored, and her authority was irrevocably shattered. She was a general without an army, a dictator without a following, a clipboard-wielding tyrant without a cause. Meanwhile, Henderson's Grim, as my house was now affectionately, and sometimes fearfully, known, was becoming a viral sensation. The photos and videos of the gargoyles, the Gregorian chants, and the ongoing saga of my battle with Beatrice Harding had spread across social media like wildfire. People were fascinated by the story, by the sheer audacity of replacing lawn gnomes with giant stone gargoyles, by the absurdity of the HOA's reaction, and by the glorious, over-the-top pettiness of it all. The online comments were a goldmine of amusement. "This is the most epic HOA takedown I've ever seen," one user wrote. "Give this man a medal," declared another. "I want gargoyles in my yard," a third commented. There were memes, there were jokes, there were even a few, surprisingly well-made, fan art depictions of my gargoyles battling a giant, beige-colored monster representing the HOA. Local news outlets picked up the story, then national news outlets, then international. I became, for a brief, shining moment, an internet celebrity known as the Gargoyle Guardian, the Suburban Stone Sentinel, and the HOA Horror Hero. My inbox was flooded with messages of support, offers of free legal advice, and even a few requests for custom-made gargoyles, which I politely declined, explaining that I was not, in fact, a professional stone carver. The final act of the drama played out, as many suburban dramas do, with a moving truck. Beatrice Harding, defeated, humiliated, and utterly unable to cope with the gargoyle-infested reality of Coral Ridge Estates, sold her house and fled to Florida, presumably to seek refuge in a community with stricter rules, fewer gargoyles, and a greater appreciation for beige. Her departure was met with a collective sigh of relief, followed by a spontaneous neighborhood block party held naturally in the shadow of Henderson's Grim. The residents of Coral Ridge Estates, freed from her iron grip, celebrated their newfound freedom, their right to decorate their yards however they pleased, within reason, of course, and their victory over the forces of HOA tyranny. The HOA, now leaderless and exhausted, effectively ceased to exist as a force of oppression. The new leadership, handpicked by me from the most laid-back and gargoyle-tolerant residents, was focused on fostering community spirit, not enforcing ridiculous rules. The age of beige was over. The era of the gargoyle had begun. And so I remained, the unlikely lord of my Gothic domain, the accidental champion of suburban freedom. Henderson's Grim stood as a proud monument to my victory, a constant reminder that even the most powerful HOA could be defeated with a little bit of creativity, a lot of determination, and a few strategically placed gargoyles. It was a crisp autumn morning. I was sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching the sunlight glint off the stone wings of my 7-foot-tall gargoyle. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, genuinely happy. A new neighbor, a young couple who'd just moved in down the street, walked by. "Excuse me," the woman said. "We're new to the neighborhood. We were just wondering, what's the deal with all the gargoyles?" I smiled. "It's a long story," I said, "but the short version is I had a disagreement with the HOA about some lawn gnomes." They laughed, intrigued. "Well," the man said, "they're certainly unique." "They are," I agreed. "They are." Who knew that a few lawn gnomes and a burning desire for revenge could lead to all this? I guess sometimes you just gotta embrace the darkness to find your peace, I thought, as I watched the new neighbors walk away, shaking their heads and chuckling. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. To Henderson's Grim, may it forever stand as a monument to the triumph of Gothic horror over HOA tyranny, and a warning to all future enforcers of suburban blandness.